Last video, we created our custom alert view controller, and I'll admit that was a pretty long video. This video will give you a little bit of a break. This will be shorter because we're going to talk all about project organization. And actually, I shouldn't say all about because we'll be continuing to thread it in throughout the videos as the project grows and grows and grows. I'll be talking about it. We'll be creating new folders and all that stuff. But I do want to throw out one giant disclaimer here. This is project organization. This is a very subjective topic, right? Like how you organize something and how you like things to be placed. Like that's going to be different for everybody. Like we all know, like programming is a highly opinionated profession. Like you've been on Twitter, right? You've seen it. So again, this is just my way. Just like I said in the intro, this is how I do it. Doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody, but at least you can see how I do it, how I organize my projects. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some basic folders to start. Again, we'll be adding folders to this as the project grows and expands. And then we're going to talk about the architecture. We're using MVC for this project, and I'll give you my little architecture rant. We'll get into that. But first, let's start organizing this giant pile of files over here on the left. Now, I know many of you out there might be looking for the textbook answer, right? You want a nice clean model folder, a nice clean view folder, and then a controller folder, right? Get that nice MVC folder. That ain't happening. That's just not how I organize my code. I find that to be, I don't know, I think you have to like dig too deep for that. So anyway, let's start creating some basic folders here. So the first folder I create, if you go hit on the GitHub followers folder, do new group to get the folder, is I do one called screens, which again is basically the view controllers, right? So this could easily be called controllers. I get it. I call mine screens. So the screens we have right now are the search VC. So let's drag that in there. We have the favorites list VC, drag that in there, and we have the follower list VC. The only screen we're missing is this user info VC you see here. That'll come later. And the reason I do the screens folder is because I do like to logically group things based on like actual screens in the app. Even though a lot of the screens are made up of like reusable views, but this way I know that like, hey, what screen is that? Because that's how, I don't know, at least in my development experience and career, like we refer to things as like, oh, it's the login screen, the whatever screen. So that's how I logically organize things in my head. So that's how I like that to reflect in my folder structure. So the next folder I typically do, and again, we're not going to do every single folder right now. We'll build those as it grows because that's more logical, is a custom views. So new group. And again, this can be the views folder, right? And we're going to get into the whole MVC definition, what is what, later in the video, but I want to get this organized first. So you do custom views, and that's where we put in things like this GF button, GF text field, title label, body label, this kind of stuff goes into custom views. And we'll break this down later as we build more of these. Right now, I'm just going to keep these four in there, but I'll break this down even further into like labels, buttons, views, more specific on like what they are. Because as you can see, we have two labels already, and I believe we're going to add another label later. So I break it down even further into that. But for now, custom views is fine. And then you see we have, I'll make this bigger, we have our UI view controller extension. I always make a folder specifically for extensions because typically, I mean, you're not going to see it so much in this project, but in my typical projects, I have a lot of extensions. Like the string extension I just showed you. There's usually always a date extension for all the date stuff you got to do. There's always a view controller extension. There's usually a UI view extension. So the extension folder usually gets pretty big. You're not going to see that in this project. I think we're going to have two extensions, but I always have the extensions folder. And you're seeing all these are at the top level right now. Eventually, again, as the project grows, we're going to, organize it as we go. But, I'll have like extensions, utilities, and I'll put those all in one like helper type folder. But again, I think like why I'm doing this kind of over time is I think if I created my whole structure right now with nothing in it, it might be more confusing than helpful. However, I feel like if we build this organizational structure as we're actually building this stuff, that'll make more sense. So let's drag the UI view controller extension there. And then even though this alert VC is a whole view controller, not just a view, I do put that in my custom views. And then usually I'll have like a view controllers folder in there because you're going to see later on in the video, like I mentioned in the intro here on the user info screen, that little card that has like the GitHub repo stuff, like that's its own view controller. The header with the username and bio and all that stuff, that's its own view controller. So those reusable components I like to put into the custom views in a view controller folder. And again, this organization will get more granular and more in-depth as we expand and build the project. And then lastly, just because, usually this will be like the folder structure, all this stuff right here, I'll usually create a folder, new group, just called support. And that's where I put in like the app delegate, scene delegate, all this extra stuff kind of goes into the catch-all. So I'll open those back up just to show you all the organization. So that is the basics of our organization. Again, we're going to go in depth as the project expands. So let's shift the topic to the architecture and the MVC, because that's what we're going to use. Why we're using MVC, what MVC is, and just my general thoughts on architectures. So I want to start off with this tweet by Sam Jarman, another developer out on Twitter. Give him a follow. He's a good follow. It says, "We're still getting this wrong, folks. Design patterns are abstract ways of arranging code meant to be applied to your unique code base and requirements. Here's the key thing. It's not a template that you have to contort your code into." So here's my spiel on like architectures, because I think a lot of people that are just learning, at least I guess based on the questions I see in my comments and on Twitter, everybody's so focused on like MVC, Viper, MVVM. Which one is it? And then you got to contort your code to fit that template. And that's what the picture says. You know, iOS developers, any design patterns come along and they're like, is this a code template? Like there's no code template. Like these architectures are just a guideline, right? Like nothing's perfect. You try to, you know, again, a guideline is the best word to put it. Like you don't have to contort and squeeze your code into this strict box. Like that's not what it's all about. Really, all that matters, like here's what it's all about. Like, is your code easy to understand? Is it like logically organized, kind of like we just talked about? Is it easy to kind of navigate and reason about how your code is structured? And then the big one, like, can it be expanded on? Because you can structure your code so it's just this like tightly bound, very coupled thing to where if you were to add a new feature to that, you just can't because everything's so tightly coupled, right? Whereas, you know, if your code is easily to expand upon, whereas like we're doing, we have all these reusable components, right? Our title label, our body label, you're going to see more and stuff of the reusable stuff. Like that means your code is expandable, right? You can easily build features into it. So really that's, you know, what you have to do in a nutshell. Like I think people are too focused on what architecture do I use? Like it's just, I mean, I use MVC. MVC is Apple's recommended architecture. It's like the classic. I think MVC will work, you know, 90% of the time if you do it right. A lot of people's gripe with MVC is that you get massive view controllers. It's too messy. And again, like I showed in the intro, here's my lines of code on this project. Like my largest view controller, you see this whole project, and I'll admit it's not a crazy complex project, but it's not like nothing. And my longest view controller is 200 lines of code. And again, I know many of you out there like may struggle with a 500 line view controller on just a basic view. So if you use what we're doing, right, the typical MVC where you're abstracting all your views out of there, right? Like the key here is like, does my view controller need to know about this? That's something you should always ask yourself. And the key is yanking that out into a GF title label, right? And then just use that. So anyway, proper MVC in my mind, you're not going to get massive view controllers. Again, as always with anything in programming, there's always exceptions, right? Nothing is absolute. For the most part, you'll be fine. But anyway, sorry I went on a little bit of a rant there. I think most beginners out there focus way too much on architecture. I'm not going to say it's not important, but like Sam says, it's not a template to contort your code into. It's a guideline. That being said, let's talk about MVC because that's what we're using. We're using the guideline of MVC. We're not, you know, shoving our code in the MVC small box. So talk about model. So what models are anything like your networking layer, persistence, your objects, like we're going to use a follower object and a user object, a little sneak peek to what we're going to build next video. So that kind of stuff is like your model. And then your views are what we've been building, right? We've been building the GF title label. If you went ahead and did the homework and built the GF alert container view, right? Like those views, this custom stuff, that's your view stuff. And then the controller is essentially the view controllers, right? The search VC, the stuff like that. So again, back to what I said a little bit ago, I think one simple thing that will really help you just conform to MVC, it's not crazy complicated. Always ask yourself, does my view controller need to know about this? And if the answer is no, think about abstracting it away. And again, that's not a absolute rule of thumb, right? This is just a guideline, something you strive for. I'm not saying that if there's one line of code your view controller doesn't need to know about, you're bad, you're wrong. Like, no, chill. So let's use this example of that container view, right? Here in the code I wrote, if you didn't do your homework, you see that all this, configuration of the UI, right? We're setting the corner radius, we're setting the border. Like the view controller does not need to know about that. So that stuff should be abstracted away. And the stuff a view controller does need to know about is like how to lay it out, right? Like the constraints. View controller's got to know about that. What text to show on the GF title label. View controllers got to know about that. So again, I think just conforming, again, at this beginner level, you're trying to get your first job, just conforming to that. Does my view controller need to know about this? I think will go a long way towards, cleaning up your code. Backing up to the big picture here, I know I just went on a little bit of a rant, but I said it earlier, like programming is like there's 100 different ways to do like everything, and it's a very opinionated profession. So I just want to stress, like what I say is my opinion. It doesn't mean another way of doing things isn't correct. It won't work. Like there's 100 different ways to do things. Do what works best for you. And a little note about taking advice, like for me, like you have to remember everybody's advice in the way they do things, their style has been shaped by their experiences. For example, my career, I've spent my whole career at early stage startups, contracting, and independent app development. So all that is based off of like literally like creating projects from scratch, building the initial MVP, getting the initial launch going. That's a different programming environment than somebody working at Google on a team of 150 iOS developers, right? Those development practices, habits, styles are going to be completely different than the small company, small iOS team, small startup style. And like, they're just not, I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just, there's different phases of development and throughout each phase, going from initial product to billions of users, all through that spectrum of time, like different phases require different coding practices. And again, when you get advice from someone, maybe they've spent their whole career at a large company and that's all they know. So just remember, you're getting advice from that angle. And when I give you advice, you're getting advice from the small startup, building the MVP from scratch angle. And it's your job to kind of discern like where their advice is coming from and is it applicable to what you're doing. Anyway, another little rant on like how to take advice, but I think that all comes into play with this architecture stuff because there's so many opinions out there about this. And I kind of go on this rant because I empathize with you out there just learning. Like you're probably getting so many different like thoughts on especially something like architecture that you don't know what to make of it. And to be honest with you, like nobody does, right? It's because it's so different for everybody. Like it's just the common programming thing, right? It depends. It's a horrible answer, but it's always the truth. Like what architecture should I use? I don't know. It depends. It's like opening up a toolbox and saying, what tool should I use without knowing what job you have to do? Like, it's a ridiculous question. So anyway, that's my architecture rant. Hopefully you got a little bit of MVC. We're going to be building out this folder structure more and more as the project grows. On to the next video, which is going to be planning our network calls.